Okay, I'm going to move on then. I asked you to note the officers' recommendations before you in terms of the reports. You can note those. Thank you. Let's move on to membership of the committee. Can the committee note the membership and chairing arrangements of the GLA Oversight Committee made at the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 3rd of May 2017?
Agreed.
Thank you. I'm moving on to item 4, terms of reference and standard delegations. Can we note the committee terms of reference and standard delegations as set out by the agenda? I'm moving on to item 5. Can we re-establishment of the working groups and panels? A list of members and chairing arrangements have been tabled at this meeting. Can the membership and the chairing arrangements of the committee working groups and panels be agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, moving on to item 6. Can we confirm the minutes of our meeting on the 30th of March 2017 so that I can sign them off? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 7. Can we note the actions arising from the previous meetings and the summary list of actions? Moving on to item 8. Can an actions taken under delegated authority, can we note the actions taken by me as chair under the delegated authority? Can I welcome Matthew to this meeting? Matthew, we've got a number of set questions we're going to ask you, but of course members will ask different, follow-on questions to what you have to say. We also might write to you further once we've considered your answers in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
So, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Assembly members, for inviting me to talk about my work. I think I was last here in October 2016. I'd been in post at that point about 3.5 weeks. So it's very good to be back, to be able to explain a bit more about what I'm doing. I think since my appointment, I've really been focused on building relationships across and beyond the GLA and the GLA group to ensure we properly understand the work that needs to be done in this area and the maximum influence on the work in this area. Chair, you're not the first person to pause before pronouncing my very long title. I think it's become a kind of running commentary every time I go to any meeting that anybody says your title is very long. But as you know, it covers 3 broad areas: social integration, social mobility and community engagement. And I look after those both in the context of my own work, of course, but also I have a role in looking at that work across the GLA and across London as a whole. There are some additional areas that I look at, and I'm really, Chair, I'm just giving a short introduction so that everybody has an understanding of kind of what I'm looking after so that it helps focus the questions. So there are some additional elements that not many people know I look at as well, but they are to the side of those 3 main areas. One of them is that I do have a role in developing civil society across London. That obviously connects quite strongly with the other areas of work that I do, but civil society plays an important part in my work. I am currently take a lead role in looking at how the GLA is dealing with philanthropy, with large philanthropic donors, seeing how we would best harness the power of philanthropy and looking at the projects and proposals that we come towards us in relation to philanthropy, and that's been a very interesting area. It's still pretty embryonic, but it's a very enjoyable area to look at for me. And then also, because of my interest in developing a social evidence base around my work, it means that I'm drawn quite strongly into the use and the role of data in driving work around the GLA. And of course, that's something which almost in every single meeting, people cry out for more data and better guidance on data. And data has become the fuel of a lot of our work. And so it's been very interesting for me to be able to take a deeper role in relation to data in the GLA generally because of how much it impacts on my work. But of course, all of that really relates to my key work on social integration, social mobility, community engagement. I think probably you're already very aware that, and from the briefings that you've had, that I have 3 main teams within my, what might be called a directorate. I have what was the Diversity and Social Policy team, which is now called the Communities and Social Policy team. The reason for that is the community engagement, or community relation team has been pulled into it. So the Communities and Social Policy team, that's the one that's been restructured. I anticipate you'll want to ask me some questions about that. I also look after Team London, and I also look after sport, both major sports events, although I do that obviously in conjunction with the events team, and community sports. And the reason for that is I need tools, actual deliverable, hard-edge tools by which to then put into effect a lot of the thinking and the policy work that comes out of the policy unit that I oversee. Team London and the sports team are doing fantastic work. I know I'm not here to talk about those today, although they fall within my remit. If you ever want to invite me back to talk about that, I'll be very happy to do so, because that's pretty interesting work. But obviously today I'm talking about community and social policy, and that's at the heart of the Mayor's bold ambition in this area. It's at the heart of the work that he wants to do, and my challenge is to take social integration and community engagement really a step further than it's been taken before, so that it underpins the work across the GLA. Community and social policy is one of the teams that's seen an important budget increase, and we've managed to use the increase we've had to leverage some really interesting secondments, which I can happily talk about for one of the initiatives that we've done. I suspect you'll want to ask me more about that. You want to probably ask me about the logic of the restructuring that we've done, and talk a little bit about making sure that in the course of that restructure we haven't had anything fall through the gaps in terms of the attention to the work that we're doing. And I'm very happy to talk about that. On our equalities work, we've been supported by a secondee in a post at the moment called Frances McAndrew. She's supported us on a number of important projects, and her work's been invaluable, and it's been very helpful to us. She's an expert she's supported a number of large public sector organisations to develop and deliver diversity strategies, and she's been very helpful to us. So there may be some questions about her work. As I foreshadowed in October, the initial period has been about us trying to receive input from Londoners so that I properly understand the landscape before we jump into actual policy and trying to deliver projects. But what have we done so far? On the 15th of June, so this month, we published the Mayor's Diversity and Inclusion Vision, which you probably have all seen. It sets out a different way, we think, of viewing equality, diversity and inclusion from what's done before. We think of it as a development and a progression. And after the 3-month consultation period, with the help of Ms McAndrew, it will lead to a diversity inclusion strategy, which is equivalent to the equality strategies that we've had before. And that will carry with it both an evidence base and a set of proposals for measuring success in more detail. It comes after a long set of consultations, interactions. I've had something like 13 roundtables with different groups. We had a social integration conference in November 2016, which was internationally attended, really successful. We did a learning exchange with mayor staff from New York, Denver, LA, Paris, just this month, which was a fantastically productive learning exchange. We've had a number of community meetings. I've attended community meetings myself. I'm currently embarking this afternoon I'll be on one of the borough visits I'm doing. I'm trying to tour all of the boroughs across London so that I get to see them personally. I get to see what projects are really being done on the ground in boroughs rather than just staying and sitting in City Hall. We've had civil society meetings, and we've had multi-faith meetings, and obviously some of that work has been done around the resilience in relation to recent incidents. So it's been a very interesting consultation period. I'm happy to describe that in a bit more detail if you want to know more about that. On the 24th of April, we launched a really interesting initiative, which I'll be happy to talk about in more detail, as a partnership with Trust for London and Unbound Philanthropy, which is a citizenship integration initiative in which we're trying to find new ways to develop citizenship. It's starting around migrants, but it's not by no means confined to migrants. We've developed new thinking on community engagement, and I should just, before finishing up, I just wanted to mention a couple of things about that. The community engagement work required some careful restructuring, but it's been extremely productive, and we've seen it in its being productive recently around the context of terrorist incidents and the Grenfell fire. The community engagement team, in their new capacity, I was able to dispatch one member of staff almost permanently over the last few days, and a second person has been pulled in working within our community engagement structure to be on the ground in West London doing that work. I've attended community meetings myself. On the 19th of June, we were asked to work with communities and mobilise. Because Team London was within my remit, I could get Team London volunteers down on the ground in West London. It was really productive as well, getting people really diverted to the rest centre and making sure that we had a GLA presence of volunteers assisting the other resilience work that was being done down there. The volunteers were deployed from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. in 2 shifts. It was a really impressive mobilisation, and we got positive feedback around that. Similarly, we're looking forward to being able to work with local authorities and everybody else who's concerned with that. But it's been a very productive process of seeing our community engagement work in action in the way that we have over the last few weeks. On the 21st of June, I personally spoke to Home Office officials seeking assurances in relation to Grenfell victims and stuff to do with those with insecure or irregular migration status, and that was also a very productive discussion which is going to continue next week. But what was useful about that is I could take that from an informed position of being able to have gone down there myself, but also had community engagement work on the ground. What are we going to be doing in the future? Well, just as a sample, but I'm sure you're going to ask me a bit more. We're building a social evidence base. We think that's a really important piece of work. It will drive work across the GLA. We're doing it with the intelligence unit, and they consider it to be a really important long-term project that will really start and last for a considerable time, developing as it goes along, to be able to underpin evidence and data for all of the teams around the GLA and share that across London. I'm planning on setting up a number of advisory boards that will enhance the capacity that we have to be able to direct the attention that I need to give to various groups within London. We'll be publishing a social integration strategy in due course. It's not a statutory strategy, but it will set out what our views are on social integration. We are currently embarking, or we've finished some work we've done on ESOL with a grant that we got, and we've got the findings on that. That's going to be published in the next few days, and we're going to embed those findings within our further work on ESOL, which we think is very important. We're developing a community sponsorship model for Londoners to do social integration. We've got work we're doing around economic fairness and poverty, which I think you'll probably ask me about, digital inclusion. We're looking at developing small grants in a more focused way. And in terms of big ideas and plans for the future, alongside the volunteer evidence base, there's some very interesting work we've been doing on volunteer incentivisation, finding a way of having volunteer underpin London life so that everybody finds an easier way to volunteer, and we make volunteering part of how you live as a Londoner, using it for social integration and community engagement. We're quite interested in harnessing the power of procurement, so we've looked quite a lot. We've fed into the recent procurement policy, and we're at the beginning, is embryonic of that, but I've taken a personal interest in the recent good procurement policy that's been published, and I fed into that, and we're seeking to see what we can do to direct procurement policy in a way that helps with diversity integration. We're looking at some big conferences exploring things that the relationship between regeneration, inequality, how you have positive regeneration in London. Some people would describe the regeneration as gentrification, and we're looking at how you balance those, the positive and the negative of that, to develop a positive outcome, and trying to engage Londoners in that debate in a constructive way. And we're also looking at developing a BAME pay gap concern and study alongside the gender pay gap that we're dealing with at the moment. There are other organisations and others who are trying to do that, and we think we want to be across the political spectrum, and we're interested in seeing if we can be at the forefront of that work. So, Chair, I'm sorry I've taken up a little bit of time, but I wanted to just give a quick sample of the kind of work that we've been doing, the kind of work we intend to do, and obviously I'm happy to go into more detail on any of the points I've made.
No, thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction, and I think the committee would welcome that. And there may well be some questions that arise from those conversations. But let's begin with some of our set questions. I mean, words are important, and I think you talked about progression and move towards. So can you just explain in a bit more detail the move from equalities to diversity and inclusion? What does the change really imply for work streams and projects in the future? What can you just give us a flavour of that, or is it more of the same of what you said in the latter part of your presentation?
I think the expression equalities was really looking about, or the way equalities have been framed in the past is really looking about, to put it in simple terms, removing barriers from people in their particular employment, but in other areas, and trying to find ways that you set a level playing field. And that's important, and I should probably say that the diversity and inclusion vision, which will become a diversity and inclusion strategy, was at one point going to be called the equalities, diversity and inclusion, but we decided that there came a point where there were just too many words in the document, and so we didn't call it the equalities, diversity and inclusion, but it could be, because it encompasses, as you can see when you read it, qualities as well. The direction of travel we think we're taking with diversity inclusion as opposed to just equalities is, I think, in fairness, a direction of travel that everybody's been moving in, including the last administration to some degree, but we hope to move further in that direction. And what it is it's move away from equalities in a simple sense and moving into a broader way of including people within the fabric of the city as a whole. And that means embracing the things that are have been foreshadowed in earlier equality frameworks, which are looking at the quality of life beyond just, say, your working life or your education, but into things like the environment, looking at the space we use in the city, and really finding more meaningful ways for people to engage from a diversity and inclusion point of view, rather than simply just a level playing field of equalities, which, if you're not careful, starts to condense down into simply meeting legal obligations. The idea for this mayor is to go beyond meeting the bare minimum of legal obligations and to find ways that London is properly a more inclusive space. There is one other thing I'd add, Chair, sorry, it's a bit of a long answer, but there's one other thing I would add, which is that with equalities work, there is sometimes a perception that within a legal framework of equalities and the Equalities Act, what you start to focus in on are simply people with protected characteristics under that act: race, gender, sexuality, disability. We want to look more broadly than that. As I indicated when I appeared before this committee on the 20th of October last year, we're very interested in social class. That's not a protected characteristic under the Act. We think it's really important. We want to look at the relationship between how outer London and inner London lives together. We want to understand more of the nuance of how people live in London life. And as a result, when we're looking at things like digital inclusion and various things of that kind, we think it's quite important to make sure that we go broader than just simply protected characteristics.
Okay, so just in terms of following up that question, I've seen three members, Tom Copley, Andrew Boff and Gareth.
Yeah, so would you say that it's a move from a more sort of, I don't know if this is the right word, passive approach to a more active approach? Whereas equality is just simply saying, we'll try and get rid of these barriers, you get on with it. Your approach is more, well, yes, we need to get rid of the barriers, but also we need to actively work to help people.
Yeah, I think that's one way of describing it, although I wouldn't want it to be seen as a kind of approach where we're dictating to Londoners how to live their lives. It doesn't go that far in terms of an active approach. What it is, though, is as I've tried to say towards the end of my last long answer, was we're trying to make sure that we are looking beyond the legal frameworks within which you remove barriers for people, and we're trying to find ways that, it's important for legislators to be able to set up a legal framework, but as those of us who are working in London in this sense, what we want to be doing is finding proactive ways that we can be more inclusive. And it means it can mean softer elements of how you include people, such as working together with the culture team and things of that kind. But it can mean a harder edge of making sure that when it comes to environment and various other things, we've got something that's beyond just the bare minimum of the legal framework and protected characteristics.
Thank you.
Andrew Boff.
You're really the Deputy Mayor for participation, aren't you?
Well, I think it's an interesting observation. I am probably the Deputy Mayor for participation.
Be sure the title.
Yeah, so I can add that.
I don't add it, for goodness sake.
But what I would say is my role goes way beyond participation. And what I mean by that is I think there's a huge element of what I do which is about communities and about making sure what would be described at a government level as communities. I think I deal with that quite considerably.
Participation in civil society.
Well, I would say something like social integration goes beyond participation. So when you're looking at, for example, equalities and removing barriers, that's not about participation. That's about finding ways to make sure people have an equal chance in their life. I think when you're looking at the stuff we're doing with civil society, we're trying to build capacity for civil society, so that's a bit more than participation. There's an advocacy role that we play in relation to, for example, poverty, and making sure that we're trying to find ways that we can add to the work that the organisations worked in poverty are doing. That goes beyond participation. So there is an ingredient, of course, within my work, I think you're totally right, that's about participation. There's a huge amount of my work that's not just about making sure Londoners participate more, it's about making sure Londoners live a more active life. So I'll give you an example. In sports, here's an example of how maybe there's a difference between participation and what we're trying to do now. In sports, one can look at what we're doing in community sport by simply how many people are participating. And to some degree, I think what was done in the last administration, that was very, very, having looked at it now, was very interesting and important work about trying to get more people involved in sport. What we're trying to do now, though, with the small grants that we've given out in relation to sports and other things, is trying to target not just participation, but how you bring people together through sports. So, for example, ways that there are migrant communities that aren't engaging with each other and aren't engaging with wider society, how you use sport to pull them in together to be more active, but also to participate more in life. Similarly, the stuff we're doing with the citizenship initiative is not just about participation, it's about finding ways that people have a journey towards citizenship in a legal way. They come out from living in the darkness. We're making sure that they're properly developing. Now, I think you can frame that as participation in society, but it's more than that.
Yeah, okay. We won't get involved in the semantic argument, but I get the distinctions. What measurables do you have?
So the social evidence base is about trying to develop the measurables. And when I came here last time, I think I tried to give the way I was doing measurements as a priority. And so we've done some work around that. I think when I came here last time, I mentioned the work that had been done by the Social Integration Commission on trying to measure social integration. They used an Oxford professor called Miles Houston, who developed a social contact theory form of measurement. And so we've worked closely with Miles Houston. In fact, in March of this year, I had a roundtable where he presented his theories alongside Runnymede Trust, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and a number of stakeholders. I think it was a room next door. Really productive meeting when we talked about metrics and measurables. And we've continued doing that work with him. And so we expect to get some kind of more concrete terms from him.
So once you've got your measurables, can you then set yourself some targets?
Absolutely.
And what are they going to be?
Well, I don't know yet until I've got the measurables, but there's no question. I mean, the whole point of getting the measurables and the whole point of getting a social evidence base is to get some targets. What we've said about the diversity and inclusion strategy is the vision is really a consultation document, 3 months consultation. But when we provide the full diversity and inclusion strategy, that will have not only a social evidence base attached to it and a more fully fleshed out strategy, but we hope to have in there some measurables that we can use to then determine whether we're hitting our marks. The temptation would have been to try and find either just carry over the way the last administration had conducted measurements. Some of it, I mean, I've been through the previous reports, the equality reports. I mean, I think there's some real merit in the simplicity and the clarity of some of the ways things were measured previously under the last administration. But we want to try and be more ambitious than that. We want to try and go a little bit further in how we're measuring things. It's not a criticism of the last administration. It's trying to develop those ideas. It's something a bit more fleshed out. And so we hope to have those by the time we're publishing the diversity inclusion strategy, which will be by the end of the year.
Thank you.
Bacon.
Thank you, Chairman. Matthew, good morning.
Morning.
Towards the end of your answer to the Chair's original question, you said that you were very interested in social class,
Yeah.
And that it wasn't a protected characteristic. Social class, I mean, that can mean all sorts of different things to all sorts of different people.
Yeah.
I do actually have public school friends who would, non-titled public school friends who would say that they are middle class. I went to the local Roman Catholic comprehensive school, and one or two people might say the same thing about me, but we are very different types of people.
Yeah.
What are you meaning when you say social class? What's your definition of social class?
Well, the working definitions that I've seen in relation to social class can include things like parental income, free school meals, those sorts of metrics in which in the education context, or for example in other contexts, you try and find a simple way that you can find out who is on a lower income scale, and therefore that becomes a proxy
to income rather than anything else.
Yeah, so that can become a proxy for social class. Our own view is that's too simplistic. And so that's why the social evidence base that we're working on, the way that's developed up is that there was some social evidence work that had been done when I arrived but had not been followed, not been continued, or was it on pause, put it that way, until I arrived. I've tried to restart that work. I chaired a social evidence group, started and chaired a social evidence group in May of this year, where Vivian, I can't remember, Vivian from the intelligence unit, one of the, Avery, thank you, Vivian Avery from the GLA intelligence unit, presented her views on how the GLA define different categories, whether it's ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc., and also how they would try and define things like social class in order to build up the social evidence base. We've got I've had officers working with her to try and follow that up, and we've got to follow up, I think, the next meeting is in September, but shortly after the summer. And what I'm hoping they'll be able to do is give us a more meaningful definition of some of these more nuanced ones like social class than we've got at the moment. Because the GLA Intelligence Unit, in my view, and one of the things I've found since the last time I was here, is a fantastically important resource, in my view, to drive the work that I do, but can drive the work across the GLA. I think it's an untapped resource. There's so much it can do. Every single stakeholder I meet in every meeting says one of the things we want to do is have more data. Everybody's grappling with how to get better data. One of the things that the Mayor's keen to do is to be a global leader in both the obtaining, sharing and protection and security of data. All those things sit together. And I think the GLA Intelligence Unit is key to being able to harness that. So social class is one of the sorts of metrics that we think we need their expertise on.
Yeah, I'm interested. My ears pricked up when you mentioned social class as a characteristic, because 100 years ago people would have understood that entirely. Everyone knew what that meant in this country. It means different things in different countries. America categorises it almost exclusively down to income.
Yeah.
But here we've sort of moved away from even using that as a definition. It tends to be socioeconomic background. I mean, do you see it as distinctively different to socioeconomic background?
I'm not sure is a short answer. I mean, socioeconomic background can be a proxy for what we generally call social class, in the sense that your background can determine what class you are. But realistically, I think that can be too simplistic, because there are people on low incomes who maybe from one particular socioeconomic background who wouldn't categorise themselves as being, for example, middle class, or similarly would categorise themselves as having moved from being working class to becoming middle class. And so therefore the socioeconomic background, whereas before you couldn't, I mean, if you want to think about how it's been defined culturally in the past one would say you could never move from the socioeconomic class you were born into. Yeah. Well, thankfully we live in a society, and part of the social mobility part of my brief, the idea is that we're trying to move away from that. But that means defining what social class is now can be a little bit more complex. So, for example, what do working class Londoners feel about X or Y is more complex than what do people who are born into a particular socioeconomic band feel about X or Y. And that we think that it may be that my ambition is going to have to be trimmed down, but my ambition at the moment is that the GLA unit, and from discussions I've had with them, intelligence unit, will be able to help us to get some definition that we can work with on that.
I wish you luck. I mean, John, now Lord Prescott, famously once described himself as having been born working class but moved into middle class, having been in Parliament for however long at that time. And his father instantly denounced him and said that he would always be working class. And of course now he's a member of our aristocracy. So I wish you luck with this, because I don't think it's going to be a very easy thing to put a framework of definition around. I'm going to watch this with interest.
Well, can I just add one tiny thing? I don't want to take up too much time on this, but one of the expressions, an example of how this plays out, is one of the expressions we hear a lot, we read it in reports, we hear it a lot in the media, is this expression, white working class boys, or working class white boys. Right? So there are two things about that I'm trying to get underneath with the help of the intelligence unit. The first is, what does the term white add to that? There are times when it just simply adds a race element that's unnecessary when you're talking about socioeconomic class. Black boys and white boys in a certain band sometimes face very similar, or non-white and white boys face very, very similar issues in relation to their educational outcomes, their engagement in the criminal justice system, their employment rates. And sometimes adding the word white seems to be a carryover from an American system where you have sort of race being very much a kind of a class indicator in a way that thankfully isn't played out in exactly the same way here. So does white add anything to sometimes we're talking about working class? And then what does working class mean? When the media talks about, when government talks about, where various reports talk about white working class boys, how are they defining working class in that context? And that's something we feel we have to at least answer, even if the answer ends up being, as your concern is, this is a meaningless concept, or we can't define this concept, then at least we have to be able to own that conclusion and say, this is why using this terminology can have its flaws, and we would be confident about it.
It's not about how we define them, it's about how they define themselves.
Well, the qualitative analysis, exactly. So the qualitative analysis... Sorry, Mr. Wilson. So when you're talking about how you would define it, what the GLA Intelligence Unit have told us is that there's a qualitative analysis as well as objective indicators in relation to something like social class. So there will be people that will define themselves as in their particular social class. But to use members' previous comment, where would the self-description of John Prescott fall within Lord Prescott fall within a analysis of whether he's working class or middle class? His own definition may not sit comfortably with some other indicators when one's looking at trying to gather statistics.
Navin Shah.
Thank you. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning.
In the context of community engagement and resilience, you mentioned multi-faith work.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what your strategic plan is and what work you're doing and how much of that work involves directly engaging with local authorities and their work as well?
Yeah. So in terms of the, let me just, there's a document I just wanted to bring up here that might help me. Can you give me 1 second? I just wanted to bring something up that I want to look at. So almost from the moment I arrived, the multi-faith element of my community engagement has been really important. We've had somebody who deals very strongly within the community relations team with multi-faith relationships. But in the context of resilience, it's become even more important. So I've had meetings with church leaders, I've had a Muslim roundtable, I've met with members from the Jewish community, and I've met with members from the Sikh community. I've met with, I don't think I haven't yet had a Hindu roundtable, but there are various other faith groups that I've met as roundtables. So I've personally engaged with those. One of the reasons that that's been a starting point for me is because I wanted to make sure that we didn't just rely on the existing relationships. And also there is an element of low-hanging fruit, if I can put it that way, with developing relationships on community engagement, that you should simply go with the easy relationships or the relationships you already know. And so one of the tasks I set officers when I arrived was to make sure that their contacts with multi-faith communities was trying to forge new links, sometimes with younger members of those faith communities, and making sure we were connecting with the right people. When the first terror attacks in relation to Westminster Bridge came up, there was a multi-faith meeting that we attended along with the Met Police, who were dealing with multi-faith groups at the time. And then there's obviously recommendations that I've taken on board in relation to further establishing a multi-faith group within the GLA. And so I have at the moment a set of work that we're doing around working out who will be part of that multi-faith resilience group, because that had been something I think had been started by the mayor before the last mayor in 2005, and we wanted to make sure that we had a strong system in relation to bringing faith leaders together in terms of resilience. So roundtables, continuing the relationships that we've had and trying to refresh who we are in contact with in relation to multi-faith groups has been a key element of the community engagement work so far. I've got a meeting, I think, tomorrow to do with faith leaders around Grenfell, because we know very well that community networks, sometimes based on faith, can be in a really effective way of us being able to get into communities and to be able to use the resources that those networks have within those communities to distribute resources and do things like that. Moving forward, I think there isn't... one of the only point that you've made where I think I don't have a complete answer to is the relationship we have with multi-faith within boroughs. I think one of the things you were asking me was how are we combining our multi-faith work with that being done with boroughs? We do that, and so I have met with various people within boroughs who are part of Multi-Faith Forum, but I think we could improve that to some significant degree. I think there are ways we could connect the GLA multi-faith organisation or multi-faith work with the borough multi-faith work. Can you just give me a moment?
Yeah, I mean, you see, some of the boroughs have excellent track record of engaging with communities and multi-faith, and it's around the year kind of activity rather than just coming together when there are issues or problems. Now, this is something you can benefit, we can benefit in terms of pulling together good practices as well as looking at where the gaps are. That is where I do strongly believe that there's need for a plan at strategic level, vision as such, as to how we can use multi-faith groups, communities to pull together those values of community cohesion and unity and so on. and this is where I do believe that working with boroughs is extremely important and necessary.
Yeah, I think if I may say so, I think that's a really good point. So some of the multi-faith groups we've worked with have been groups that have got initiatives. I've met with a group around women, Jewish leaders and Jewish women and Muslim women getting together around multi-faith issues. I'm meeting with them, I think, in 2 weeks' time. I met with a number of people during the course of Ramadan on multi-faith iftars. I attended a number of iftars to make sure that, we were basically enjoying all the invitations that have been provided to me in the GLA that really enabled me to kind of see on the ground various people and see multi-faith communities coming around iftar. Iftars weren't simply Muslim events only attended by Muslims across London. They were really fantastic multi-faith events. But I think we have done work with the multi-faith groups within boroughs, but I think to some extent that's been a case of pulling different people together and they happen to be within boroughs. I think a more structured approach to tapping into the networks that boroughs have developed themselves, I think would be very valuable. So that's certainly something I'll take on board.
Thank you.
Jeanette Arnold.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Matthew, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Amanda. And Matthew, when you appeared in front of this committee at the start, I welcomed your appointment and I loved your introduction this morning. And it speaks to conversations that have been whirling around for many years about the need to both appreciate the legal structures that we have, but also to actually then say, but what does that mean in the life of, say, and I'll use myself, a woman who is black and in terms of class, who is at the height of her career, then what's her experience, if you like, of living in London? And you can't do that if you just look at that in a sort of legislative framework, and you may not be able to understand then that that individual, although appearing to be successful, may well be subject to discrimination because of any of those factors, and it's a really tricky, complex thing. So I'm wanting to know, and a lot of that stuff came out of, and I'm sure you'll know her work, Professor Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. Are you going to bring that sort of thinking into the GLA and then enable the GLA in terms of how it operates as an employer across the GLA group to maybe have an impact on both its gender profile, its racial profile, and age and whatever other indicator you're using?
The short answer is yes, and the way that manifests itself is there are a number of ways that immediately I can explain it would take effect. The first is that our diversity and inclusion vision very much is trying to pull us towards something which is closer to understanding intersectionality. So it's looking at people having different characteristics or combination of characteristics within their life which can affect their... So you could be a black woman in the workplace, you could be a gay person in the workplace who is affected by things in a number of different ways. And as a result, it's really, really important that we look at that. The Equalities Task Force has obviously done important work in relation to trying to understand, within the GLA, has done important work trying to understand how BAME impact alongside things that impact women and gender sit together. So the combination of trying to gather both of those sets of data and seeing how they interact with each other has been really important. I've for example, been to a task force meeting where we've looked at the relationship between gender and race in interviewing and recruitment and things of that kind. And then it's played itself out quite powerfully in many of the community engagement roundtables that I've had and trying to move forward. So simply to give an example, when I had the LGBT roundtable, one of the most thought through, advanced, some of the most sophisticated sort of long-standing groups of community organisations across London, one of the things they were talking about and that we took up in the discussion was the extent to which those organisations had sometimes been too focused simply on the fact that they were assisting the gay community and weren't necessarily embracing the diversity within the gay community. And as a result, it was really important that those organisations, if they, for example, were focusing on homeless gay people, had to make sure they were not providing a service that didn't feel welcome to people who were of a different faith or of a different ethnicity or something of that kind. And I was really encouraged by the fact that not only were they embracing the nature of intersectionality within their work and understanding how important that was, but they also understood why we at the GLA felt it was very important that they did so. It wasn't simply, in the current climate, wasn't simply good enough to say, well, you work with one community and not another. But what I also found really positive is that I think if you tried to talk about intersectionality 3 or 4 years ago, someone would have thought you were a strange oddity who was bringing some strange academic idea into the arena. And it felt very mainstream for these organisations to be talking about, whether you would describe it as intersectionality, that's a complicated title, but different people having different aspects of who they are and having to cater for the combination of those things. I'll finish. You've got me on a point that I'm quite interested in. So the only thing I would add, I might have mentioned it previously, is that there was some very interesting work that was done about 8 years ago. I think it came out of the University of Birmingham by Professor Rollock, and she looked at the nature, the interplay between class and race in educational outcomes. And what was really interesting, it goes back to one of the things that we were talking about earlier, that for African Caribbean boys and white boys at a certain socioeconomic level, educational outcomes were broadly similar. And really race didn't play a factor. When you went up one brand in socioeconomic status, their outcomes were quite different. And so slightly counterintuitively to many people, the impact of race seemed to be more pronounced higher up the socioeconomic scale than lower down. Or to put it a very simply way, when you're really suffering at the lowest end of the socioeconomic ladder, being poor is your problem. It's only when you manage to get above that being race can be an issue. Race becomes more of an issue, rather. So those combination of things are really interesting, and we're trying to... It's part of our work trying to embrace that complexity a little bit.
And just finally, Chair, given that the whole thing is so complex, and I'm with you there, because when myself and other people were talking about intersectionality, because we were taken up with the whole gender issue and the work that was being done, came out of America in the 80s, there was a huge, strong body that says, don't talk about it, because we haven't got the legislative structure right, because that really is what we need. And I'm just asking you, are you aware of that concern, that there are bodies, there are big groups who will be fearful of change, and then will you be willing to be as transparent as possible and share as much as possible? Because I think it's in the sharing, because you can't be everywhere. And the difficulty is with this is that you can't send clones to speak for you. I think it's about how we share the direct material. So how are you going to enable that transparency, and have you got the systems sorted from here so that people can access this work, and not in 9 months' time, but as it's developing?
Yeah, I think you've always got to strike a balance between sharing something that's half finished and therefore liable for it to be taken in out of context, and sharing a piece of work that's finished. So by way of an example, the ESOL work that we're doing that I think will be explaining our conclusions from that work and what our next steps are from that work in the near future, within the next week or so. That should be very interesting. And our default position is to try and be as open as we possibly can be. So we'll try and be sharing all of that work as we go along. But there is one thing I wanted to add about your point about complexity, if I may. I think it's right to say that you can get into these issues and they become very complex, and it starts to become a bit of an academic discussion. And I will say, probably slightly out of character, reading the previous equality reports of the last administration, as I said before, the clarity and simplicity of how they tried to measure things and how the targets they set is appealing. There's something appealing about that, and I can see why that is attractive. So it's very important for us as we go into trying to embrace the complexity of things, not to lose sight of how you then have to condense it down to simple, measurable attributes. An example of how we're trying to do that is a BAME pay gap exercise. It is not too complicated to undertake, in my view. I mean, we haven't been able to finish it or complete it or get involved in it yet, but I'm hopeful it's not too complicated to do. But it is complicated. It's not as simple as a gender pay gap, because identity issues around ethnicity are more complex. But that doesn't mean, A, you make it so complicated it becomes unworkable. You try and condense it into something simple. But B, you do embrace that challenge or rise up to that challenge of doing something a little more complicated than the simple stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to go back to the core questions, which were on core question 2. Right?
Sorry.
Exciting.
Okay, of the 5 themes that of the Mayor's vision, can you just explain briefly how they were arrived at, and what do you think is the most challenging for the GLA and the GLA family of organisations?
So the 5, we had a lot of help from, as I said, the person who has helped other organisations with this, Francis McAndrew. And the 5 areas we felt were really to try and cover, in a broader sense, the way Londoners live, and capture that in a way that was beyond just simply categories. So it was an attempt to say in simple language, in an easily understandable way, the different types of ways that Londoners live. So place to live, place to grow up, place to work and do business and getting around. So those were what Ms McAndrew and working with officers felt could encompass all of London life, the multiplicity of London life, but in under 5 simple headings. I think the second part of the question was how does that go beyond?
Well, what's the most challenging of those themes, and in influencing the GLA's work and the rest of the GLA family?
I think it's difficult to pick one, because I think they've all got their challenges. I think that a great place to grow up is probably amongst the most important of those. And the reason for that is because we want to move away from what I understand to be a reasonably embedded position of child poverty being a fairly consistent theme of London life, even though London is very affluent. And we want to make sure that we're in a position where we can push some of the groups that have seemed to be entrenched in not being able to find work at the same rates as other groups, trying to move forward so that young people journeying from school into skills can develop those skills, and we're removing the kind of disproportionality of certain groups within that journey. So if you were to ask me where do I think our focus should be in these 5, they're all important, but I would probably be looking quite heavily at 2.
Okay. And if we just go on for it, much of the vision is going to be delivered via mayoral strategies, and some of those are being delivered now.
Yeah.
How confident you are getting the proper consideration of being given to diversity and inclusion within those strategies and by the other parts of the family of the GLA? I'm thinking very much about, well, let's put it this way. Let's take a young people's theme. One aspect of that would be about growing up in a secure and safe environment.
Yeah.
Well, there's a policing role in that, of treating young people not as criminals but as citizens that need protection, and remembering it's the minority of young people that commit crimes. The vast majority deserve protection and to be taken seriously when they report issues. So how are you going to influence those different strategies that others are getting on with in terms of making sure on the ground they become more practical and realisable?
I think there are three ways. The first is that we input into their own strategies. And the second is that we are in contact with them in terms of working groups that have a multiplicity of disciplines on them. I'll come back to that in a minute. And I think the third way is making sure that within our own diversity and inclusion strategy, we're very clear as to what we feel should be done. So in relation to the first one, we've inputted so far into all of the strategies that have been published, and I've made sure that I'm inputting into all of the strategies that are coming out, whether it's knife crime strategy, but whether it's statutory strategies as well. We're trying to make sure that we input into those in a meaningful way. Some of them are challenging. So, for example, something like the London Plan, how we input into that is sometimes a question of negotiating with those drafting the plan, because and so, for example, there may be elements in which they'll say, this is something we can have an input into. Something else, our most effective way of inputting may be to have an interpretation document that sits alongside the strategy, because some of the detail that we might want isn't suitable to go into the London Plan in the same level of detail that we want it in. So there can be aspects of that are, I have to kind of both learn and navigate. But having those discussions can be really important in terms of making sure that I'm involved in the publication of those strategies. I then sit on combined working parties. So another good example of that is economic fairness. I sit on that group with the Deputy Mayor for Business. It's chaired by Mr. Jacobs. We're in a situation where we have a combination of different teams and disciplines inputting into how we're dealing with economic fairness. And the value of that has been that, obviously from a business point of view, it's very, very important that London business travels with us on the journey into economic fairness. If you alienate the business community, then you're not going to be able to get purchase on what's going on. At the same time, what my team and some of the work that we're doing on poverty brings there are things like understanding not just the nature of things like minimum wage and things of that kind, which employers understand as well, but it's about going beyond legal requirements. It's also about trying to understand what the Mayor described as good corporate citizenship. In other words, making sure that something like their business plan as how they work is being carried out in a way that doesn't discriminate against people of a lower income in a particular way. And then also working closely with the skills team to make sure that if there are particular communities that aren't accessing their skills offer, then we have to make sure we use our community engagement network to make sure they access them. So, for example, with work being done on construction, we want to make sure that there's access to African Caribbean boys who sometimes aren't being included in that, or aren't taking up that offer at the same rate as other parts of the community.
Thank you for that. The next question is around measuring your performance, which I think you partially answered earlier on. Unless there's a new aspect to the question, we might follow up in writing to that around
happy
that.
to do that.
If we can then move on then to the staffing issues. I think Jeanette Arnold has got some questions.
Yes, I have. Yeah, 6.
Oh, 5.
5. To get all this work done, will you need extra staff? And your answer is yes. Sure. Yes, okay. So,
We've got three new posts.
right. And that is in addition to what you told us before about secondments.
So we've used 2 of the posts to leverage our 2 additional full-time posts from our partners in that work. So we developed it. We launched in April this year the Citizenship and Integration Initiative with Unbound Philanthropy and Trust for London.
Right.
The funding that they provided to us, which is pretty substantial funding, has allowed us to have 4 part-time posts or 2 full posts within that team, and that enables us to have a pretty good complement within the social integration team to make sure that work is carried out.
Thank you. So now you also you're then working toward that budget of about 1.5 million.
That's the 1.5 million is a programme budget.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And how does that divide down across your area of responsibility?
So the 1.5 million is for the community and social policy team. It's not for sports. There's additional figures for sports and for Team London, which just in passing had been no growth in relation to those teams.
Right.
I think in terms of headline figures, there's roughly speaking, it breaks down to the majority is within social integration. There's also a substantial amount in relation to social evidence based, and then there are smaller amounts in relation to social mobility and the community engagement.
Okay. And just for information, then within this communities group, what sort of posts can we find there?
So I don't know if you have any form of kind of organogram at all, but when we indicated the new structure that we would have, let me just bring it up. So
the organogram was in the oversight paper that went
it should
on May
be.
16.
That
So what
went
we
through
have is
in August. That went.
Yeah.
Where was that?
There was an oversight paper that went on the 16th of May, and there was an organogram attached to that.
You went to group leaders, I believe.
No, didn't go to members.
So the organogram that I have on your on the document, we have a document I have is a document that I thought you might have, but maybe you don't.
No,
The
we
document
don't.
looks like this,
No, we don't have that.
and it has organograms attached to the back.
No.
Okay.
No.
So I'll just explain it very quickly. Within the new structure of the community engagement team, we have a community engagement manager, and then we have 5 officers within the team. Strictly speaking, there's an additional officer, but that officer sits within the intelligence unit.
And what's their job titles going to be?
Sorry, one second. I've just been. Might need to correct. Yeah. Sorry. The one thing I should have clarified is that there's a civil society data post, so that's a slightly different post within that team. Yeah.
Okay.
But we can get you the organogram in the document. It will explain it. That explains the structure of that team.
But the titles, the job titles.
So they're all community engagement officers.
Mm-hmm.
They don't. If what the concern is that you may be asking me about is, do they have particular areas of responsibility within the community engagement team?
Finger on the spot.
Right. And just as in the last structure, no one has within their job title a particular area of responsibility. The idea is that we don't limit an officer to having a particular area of responsibility in terms of which community engagements they'll be involved in, and we ensure that we pick the most suitable officer for different types of engagement. So, for example, the 3 community relation officers in there at the moment, and one of them is left now, but Rhiannon Watson and David Wood have a kind of pretty varied portfolio of different communities that they engage with, which sometimes don't condense into very simple categories, partly because each of them knows some communities better than they know others. The concern in relation to that, though, is do you end up with a situation where if you have kind of officers who have a broad expertise, generic expertise, do you end up with a situation where nobody really takes responsibility for gender, nobody really takes responsibility for LGBT?
It would be a worry, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and if I may say so, I'm old enough to have worked as a barrister for the Commission for Racial Equality. I remember when it changed and it was abolished and pulled into the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I did work for them as well. I remember the debates around moving from a specific area into a more generic area and the discussions that were had around that. So there are 2 things that I would say about that, because I'm very conscious of that concern. The first one is that we would make sure that officers understood what their responsibilities were if we felt they were particularly well suited on an informal basis. So we would make sure that if somebody had a particular knowledge of or experience of a particular community, that we made sure we were picking the right person for that job. We do want to make sure, I think I should make it clear, we do want to make sure that officers have a range of skills. It's no good if they can only deal with, for example, ethnic minority communities and don't know how to engage with equalities with LGBT communities, precisely for some of the reasons you identified earlier about intersectionality. So we do want officers with a greater set and broader range of skills, but we will try and find those who are best suited in a particular circumstance. One of the things, though, that I think underpins this approach for me, and why I think it's an acceptable approach for me, is that I want to make sure we have sufficient expertise being applied to this work, that it is guided and structured in the right way. And let's take race for an example. I convened a race advisory group, roundtable, some months ago, with some of the leading people in relation to that area around that table. They were very keen to impress on me the importance of having policies, structures, advice, guidelines around race. It wasn't simply enough to have equalities. They wanted something that was a bit more fleshed out. And my own view is when I mentioned before about setting up advisory panels, that's the kind of advisory panel that I would have in mind, that I would be able to draw on, me personally, not delegating that to an officer, draw on the expertise of some of the leading figures in an area, whether it's LGBT or race or ethnicity, or race or multi-faith or whatever, and make sure that when we were developing policies of community engagement and context around community engagement, we were drawing on that high-level expertise and being able to do so. That way, we overcome the problem of feeling like we need to have high-level expertise automatically in every area within the team, because that's simply not possible if we're going to try and catch the multiplicity of that. Put it another way, if you were going back 20, 30 years, you say you have a race person, a gender person, and you deal with it in really simplistic ways. I don't think that works in 2017. I think you need it to. So you need people who understand race, you need people who understand gender and LGBT rights, but they need to be more able to understand a combination of things, and you need to be able to draw in expertise from outside. It's got to be a bit more sophisticated.
So this advisory body, whether they be race, gender, or age, or whatever it is, you would draw that in and then provide, which sounds good.
And it also provides, forgive me for interrupting, it also provides accountability. In other words, those are the kind of people
That's what I was going to, in terms of how do we then get accountability, because you're saying then it's these advisory bodies brought in by you that are actually then determining the policy direction and action. So how are they going to be held accountable?
So the accountability for any area, if we're falling short in any area, is with the members of that senior people in that team, and ultimately, of course, with me.
Right.
But when I talk about accountability, if, for example, when you're talking about race, our work in relation to community engagement around race isn't good enough, we will hear it from that advisory group.
Right.
We won't be waiting for somebody to tell us from the outside the GLA hasn't done this and that. We will be in contact with those groups, whether it's LGBT rights, older Londoners, disabled. I mean, some of the most vocal advocates I've been dealing with have been disabled Londoners who said, you're not doing this and you're not doing that, or you need to do this, you need to do that. And from the point of view of accountability, we are dealing with it full on in those kind of advisory groups, so that by the time, so that we have a chance to rectify any deficiencies before they start to develop and become embedded. But ultimately, accountability for any area that falls short in community engagement lies with the managers and then with me.
Okay, I just raised this. I think, Chair, bear with me. I just think this is just so important that we get some clarity on this at a time where racist and religious hate crime is on the rise. I know we're going to be dealing with that from a police point of view, but then again, you know, race hate and faith hate is not just to be sat within the purview and policing, because you've actually got to deal with the other circumstances that drive that. And so my only concern is somebody looking in on the work of the GLA, how are they going to see that we are as equally committed to the work that is necessary around race equality, and there's no other way to put that, around respect of faith for those groups and for those who don't have faith. And that's what I'm still struggling with this new structure.
Well, I think it seems to me, to try and answer that, there are a couple of issues. The first one is, should we make job titles include particular features like race or gender or...
Is it in the job
sexuality?
specification?
And the reality is that my concern is with a small group of officers, when we're trying to deal with important issues across London and that cover a whole range of different characteristics, we could end up with people whose area of expertise and area of focus is too narrow. They start to work within their little box of gender or race or whatever it is, and as a result we're not in a situation where we're covering all that we need to cover.
Okay.
The second point though is sorry, just to take up the point. The second point though is, what statement are we sending to Londoners if we don't have somebody that is saying publicly, I am taking responsibility for race,
and
I
faith.
am taking responsibility, or faith or gender, right? And I think that's a very valid point, that we need to make sure that the public has confidence that when they look at our work, there is somebody who has responsibility for that. I'm really open to working out whether it's best done in a job title, a job description, or whether that's also covered by us championing the advisory groups and the work that we're doing. So it may be through championing the substance of the work. For example, if we have some guidelines in relation to faith or guidelines in relation to disability or whatever, by championing that work, people can see the officers who are involved in it, the community engagement team is doing it. Or whether that needs to be in job titles. I mean, I'm open to the right way forward on that, but you can see we've grappled with it because we felt by putting the, job titles or job descriptions that had specific areas, if, for example, it turned out that we ended up with somebody who was very good on two areas, not good on another, you need to be able to cover those bases in slightly different ways. And we didn't want people who thought, my job is race, my job is gender, my job is disability in too restrictive a way. But I'm open to discussion on
Yeah, Chair, I mean, I totally understand what's been said, but I welcome the fact that Matthew appreciates what I suppose people call the optics or how this then looks. And I think that's so important when it comes to community confidence, especially at this time,
I appreciate that.
where so much is raw in our environment around race and faith. So I would ask him that he looks very closely and then seek advice as to see how this can be done. I totally take the point. It's not for me having a post which says I am the race advisor, but it does concern me that in some of the job descriptions and the narrative that I looked, I could find gender. And I mean, I love that. I'm a feminist, but I'm also a black woman, so where was race? I'm also a woman of faith, but I absolutely respect that there are people without faith who have their own space. But I didn't feel that sense.
This is a good point.
And I think that has to be addressed, otherwise it's a problem.
Okay, I think you've had some assurances from the Deputy Mayor on that. Would you, at the appropriate time, write back to the committee members, and particularly Jeanette Arnold, who's not a committee member but here today as a substitute,
Follow that up.
and see you in terms of how that thinking is being developed and in how quickly you come to it?
I'm happy to do one step further than that. Happy to write, and then also happy to have a further discussion that follows up from what we...
It might be offline and it might be without particular members, but I welcome the invitation for that, and we will work that one
Through
through.
your office, Chair. Happy to do that.
Happy to do that.
Okay, on the to remaining questions, can we follow up those in a written form? Let's move on. I'm now, I think, Assembly Member Sean Berry, questions 7 and 8.
Can I just follow up on a couple of things?
Yes.
And come back to question 3.
Yes,
is
please.
That all right? Sorry, you don't even know what question 3 is. We were asking in question 3 about how your work relates to the mayoral strategies, because obviously you said you acknowledged before you're having a strategy, but it's not strictly a statutory strategy. And the mayor's strategies and the rest of the GLA group will actually be the ones delivering a lot of the things that you do. Although I did notice within the strategy, the vision document, quite a few things sort of labelled as projects.
Yeah, sorry.
That your team will be delivering.
I don't want to be loyally, but when you were saying that the mayor's other statutes would be delivering, that's not how we see it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are statutory strategies, but that doesn't mean you can't develop something that's equivalent to a strategy. It just doesn't have to be a statutory strategy through which you seek to deliver outcomes. And we see the equality, I mean, I think, I don't know what the 99 Act had in mind, but I think the reason why you don't have an equality strategy in the 99 Act is because it's covered by legislative duties in relation to the Equalities Act and other sorts of equalities to which you report against. But in a sense, we operate the strategy that we have on diversity, inclusion and equalities as though it is as important and something that we work towards and we develop projects towards in the way I think that the culture team would in relation to a culture strategy or the environment team in relation to environment strategy. So the only small correction I'd make on that is we do want to deliver projects through our strategy, even though it's not a statutory strategy, and we're not relying just on others to deliver.
Yeah. So you will have teams delivering projects.
Yes.
You'll also be doing some sort of level of oversight. This is what I'm getting at, is that you'll be doing some sort of level of oversight, review, intervention of how the mayor's other work with the rest of the GLA group is delivering on things that you have concerns about. Obviously, we're the Oversight Committee. We kind of have that remit too, as part of the Assembly. So, in terms of coordination in your projects and things, will there be a forward plan? Will we be able to see what you're working on at any time, what data you're getting together?
It depends on what level of detail you're descending into. Will you be able to see what we're working on at any specific time? I'm not sure that level of detail is practical, because sometimes we're in discussion about what the projects might be. I don't know sometimes what's being incubated within a particular team, and it comes to me once it's been... So I don't have a full kind of window into the minds of all my team members until I end up with policy being presented to me, and then I need to decide whether it's a good idea or not before we start talking about it to the world, and then you need to see it before the world knows about it. So there are stages, obviously, just for practical reasons. But certainly I would hope that we work alongside you in terms of overseeing whether equalities and whether people are living up to their aspiration. From my point of view, when it comes to diversity, inclusion, social integration, social mobility, within the strategies that they publish. So you'll be looking, for example, at how the Transport or London Plan or whatever, how they live up to what they say in their documents. We will too. We'll be looking at those documents and saying to what extent is that really performing the role that we thought it would perform in relation to social integration. Policing is a really good example. You know, we want to make sure that if there are things, and there are some good aspirations that the police and crime plan have put forward, and we want to make sure we help them. And so I'll give you an example on that. One of the things we're doing, rather than just sitting back, we have a slightly different role. We're not going to sit back and see what their outcomes are and then assess them. So one of the things we're doing is, when it comes to knife crime, we're looking to see how we can enhance the existing community engagement that's being done by MOPAC, how we can use our community engagement networks to enhance what they're doing, for example, through peer-to-peer youth engagement.
That was my next question, well anticipated.
There you go.
Essentially, yeah, so there are aspects of things like the police work, particularly on knife crime, particularly on communications, where they've got a budget to communicate with young people why not to do knife crime, why not to carry a knife. It really overlaps with work you might be doing, and potentially, I mean, I've been identifying ways in which some of the police communications about their own enforcement work on knife crime results in massive knife pictures being in the newspapers, potentially undermining the message that you don't need to carry a knife by instilling fear. So is that the sort of thing where you might try and intervene? And could you make a case to the Mayor at a more strategic level for the work that the Met does on communications to actually, you know, that budget to come into your team, potentially, so that you can do it in a more integrated way, rather than have the police doing a bit of communication and you doing a bit and it maybe being contradictory?
Yeah, so there's two sides to that. The first side is, are we going to try and find a way to make sure that if we think there's an improved way, a better way to do it that aligns with our work, should we work closely with them rather than do our work on the side?
Yeah.
I mean, the obvious answer is yes, but the mechanisms by which we do that are pretty important. So I've met with Sophie Linden, for example, on knife crime strategy, both through going through the strategy, met with her personally a couple of times to talk about my concerns, her talking to me about her concerns, making sure we align the work that we're doing, and then also making sure our teams are working so they're not duplicating work and they're working in a constructive way together. I've got to say on the question of should we be seeking some of their budget on comms.
That's quite...
Yeah, that's a little bit... the complexity of that, I mean, I think that's quite a severe measure in terms of the extent to which we would need to be satisfied that we can only get the work done that we felt we needed to do by seizing a bit of somebody else's budget. And I don't think we're at that point. From our point of view, we think that there is some benefit in certain comms coming through MOPAC with their budget, certain different style of comms or type of comms coming through us with our budget, and the two things being complementary rather than one group trying to take. We wouldn't want them to take control of our comms on that level and vice versa. Yeah.
Okay, oh, thank you for that. One final thing on that is the living rent question. I noticed in the strategy at the moment, there's a lot of sort of reliance is placed on just the concept of a living rent. Yeah. We've talked before about, and we'll have questions in a bit about the pay gap there is for women, and how that relates to the fact that the living rent is the average and women earn below the average on average. Is that the sort of thing you're still going to look at? Because I was hoping to see that more in the vision document, but it isn't there.
Well, certainly we'll look at it. Something like living rent, I mean, obviously we have to work closely with other deputy mayors in relation to something like that, housing in particular. And some of that information is more about me feeding into policy rather than formulating my own policy on something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point. If it's not got enough emphasis within the division document at the moment, we'll make sure that it comes out more fully in the final strategy. I mean, I think if it needs more emphasis, then we should take that on board for sure.
Okay, we'll feed in some more questions on
Yeah,
that.
that's fine.
Will you be answering Mayor's questions if we put in questions about your work? Is that how we can do that?
The Mayor answers Mayor's questions.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I
But we
answer
can
Mayor's
ask,
questions.
I mean, I know you don't have a strategy, but we can ask specific questions about your work and what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Now you have
of course,
a-
absolutely. Yeah. The
great.
Mayor will answer them, but
Obviously, yes,
we'll help him
technically, yes.
if it's to do with my area for sure.
Okay, so moving on to my proper questions here.
Yeah.
I have a question about the economic fairness team. Can you tell us what your involvement has been in the development of that?
So it's a group that meets to discuss how we can move forward the Mayor's commitments on economic fairness. I've been one of the deputy mayors involved in that. I think Joanne McCartney is involved in that. Rajesh Agrawal, the Mayor's policy advisor, Nick Bowes, has had an input into that. Jeff Jacobs has an input into that, chairs it. And there's a number of officers who also are involved in that. It's a group which works up how we can best impact on economic fairness, and at the moment the focus of that work has been how we can develop what might be called a sort of standard or a compact with business to make sure that the focus on or the way employers in London treat their workers has proper regard for economic fairness considerations. And of course that means living wage, it means treating workers with proper respect to their rights, it means shared parental leave where possible, all those things that you'd want to have that are good work practice. But it means us trying to take things a little step further than just the statutory obligations and trying to make sure that we've developed a standard of good practice that employers can sign up to in terms of how they treat their employees. I'm not in a position to say much detail about it, and what I've mentioned before are really simply examples, because I think we're going to be announcing the detail or the outcome of that work very shortly. I mean literally within the next few days.
So that's the content of the standard, what the standard is. In terms of how you use it, you said employers can sign up to, which doesn't sound like it might have very much teeth. Earlier on, you said you want to employ the power of procurement. So is that something that then, once it's got the standard, you'll want to really push through GLA procurement?
So there are two different things. So the standard of workers and how they treat their employees is not the procurement issue. That relates to across London how workers are treated by those who they work for, right? Mm-hmm. The procurement power I was referring to earlier was how do we utilise the power that an organisation like the GLA has in terms of procuring work or big procurers of work. How do we make sure they do that in a fairer way and do that in a way that properly meets economic fairness considerations? I'll give you an example. Yesterday I attended a meeting with some business leaders, and one of the things we were talking about was and the extent to which procurement needs to understand issues of diversity, but beyond that has to make sure that you create a business ecosystem that feeds smaller businesses as well as larger businesses, because there's no point just having procurement from big providers who say we can cover everything that you need in the service. You have to try and make sure that you have proper regard to making sure that smaller businesses are also assisted, so that you provide a good ecosystem for large and small businesses, because otherwise smaller businesses just wither away when they try and compete with the larger providers. So that's just a really
that's fine. That's
simple
fine.
example.
So essentially,
But procurement is not the same as the procurement. Talking about the power of procurement, that's not the same discussion as what rights employers should give their employees.
Yes, I understand. So essentially, the business compact will still be a voluntary scheme. There won't be any kind of levers being pulled in City Hall to make it.
The Mayor has legislative powers to enforce employers as a matter of law to do something beyond their legal requirements on the legislation. I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I don't think the Mayor has some legislative power he can deploy.
Well, we can talk about this later, but possibly the power of procurement is one of those things.
Yeah. Procurement's different. So being in a situation where the Mayor, and also employment within the GLA is different.
Yeah.
So there are ways that the Mayor interacts with people who are working or people who are providing services that are about utilising the power of the GLA. That's not the same as a document that requires working and employment that's not connected with the GLA across London.
No.
To be to a
No,
certain
I realise
standard.
the legal
Yeah.
issues, but in terms of what the GLA itself chooses to, which businesses it chooses to engage
Mayor's been
with.
pretty clear that he wants us to lead by example, and that would be in the context of employment. That would also be in the context of procurement as well.
Okay. So moving on to financial exclusion, which is obviously mentioned in the report.
Yep.
This also, I think, are you aware of the fact that the Economy Committee is going to be looking at this issue coming up?
I mean, to be honest, I was aware it's an issue being looked at. I'm not in a position to be able to kind of go into the detail of that. I'm not sure as to the dimension that they're looking into.
Yeah, so again, I think...
And what the focus is going to be.
Potentially, that investigation is going to be looking at measuring financial exclusion, which I think is probably something your team will also be looking at. So potentially the data you're collecting, the work you're doing to try and measure financial inclusion or exclusion.
I won't go into any detail. All I'll say is that the data that they collect, we want to make sure we can have that at the very least combined with the data we're collecting on social evidence. It may be that the best way, on advice from the intelligence unit, will be to combine that data as part of our social evidence base. We're not sure yet, but we certainly want to look at the best way we can access and use that data.
Okay, and so what do you see as assuming we uncover the different investigations uncover significant financial exclusion? I have to say, I'm a local councillor, I'm quite aware of this myself. The amount of people who don't have insurance following the recent fire, the evacuation, it's quite scary. The amount of people who don't even have enough savings to get themselves an extra day's eating out. That's the sort of thing that we're seeing. Assuming you do see all of that, what role do you see for the mayor in addressing those issues? Do you have any thoughts on that yet?
It's difficult because the mayor's powers to be able to influence that environment are pretty limited. And so I can't give a kind of quick, glib answer. What I will say in terms of what I've been trying to do on it, I considered this issue important enough that I had 2 separate meetings with poverty organisations and campaigners over the course of 3 weeks. So two 2-hour or 1.5 hour roundtables on poverty with the different groups to make sure that we got their view on what they think the mayor can do. Some of that can be things that are advocacy that they'd want the mayor to join in with, and that sort of issue is something that would need to be appropriate for the mayor, and that's sort of not really my area as to whether the mayor should join with this bit of advocacy or not. We can simply say what the organisations would like him to join in with. Some of it may be about publishing good standards. So, for example, I've talked about the Economic Fairness Unit publishing a good work or standard about how employers and employees. It may be that not within that particular document, but subsequently further work from the Economic Fairness team is going to be looking at something that's about the economic fairness environment beyond just workers and employees. So things like financial exclusion, stuff like that. That's the next stage of work. So I don't have a simple answer. What I do have is, or what I can say, is that I do have an answer beyond the position I was in October, which is that I've met with the campaigners, we've established those links, and what we're trying to do is get from them what they think the response should be. By way of example, we met with CAB, or Citizens Advice, as it's now called, and they made some really great offers to us on data, sharing data and how we can use data, which had never been made before. And because we were in the environment of this roundtable, they made a similar offer to ensure that others would have access to similar kind of data. It's been very productive. I think also you're going to see this issue played out in other strategies. So fuel poverty, it's going to come out in relation to, it's going to be present. And my job, I think, in one sense, is to see how, in the context of the people who have worked in poverty, how do we pull that together? Okay, and I hope you'll find the Economy Committee's reports useful in that respect. It sounds like very helpful. And that the work where it can be integrated rather than duplicated. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, Navin Shah.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are regarding the pay gap. Can you outline the actions taken under the City Hall Gender Pay Action Group? action plan, please?
Can I?
Yeah. Can you give us information about the actions taken under the City Hall Gender Pay Gap Action Plan?
I'll tell you the approach I'd like to take to this, if I can, Mr. Shah, is that I do have a briefing on that, but the work that's been done on that has really been led by others on the gender pay gaps. Although I can answer those questions, I don't know if it's probably appropriate that if I hand over to others who have had more hands-on approach.
Should we follow, no disrespect to Navin Shah in terms of answering the question, do you mind if we follow up in a written form? In terms of those questions, if we do that, rather than...
Okay.
I can answer them, but I would be answering as a mouthpiece for the person that's really done the work, and I think that probably is better coming straight from the person that's done
We'd also like to know what the actual current figures are in terms of data that is not released since 2016.
Yeah.
Because 2016 figures did show something like 4.5% pay gap when it came to sort of gender balance, and it was higher, around 7% for part-time women workers. So we would like to have an update on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things I probably should mention. I think it's to the credit of the GLA, they've been recognised as a Times Top 50 employer for women. I think the work on gender pay gap has been part of that. I think it is important to note the work that we've done on apprenticeship or career development, no-name applications, developing the women's network and things like that. I think in terms of the numbers that you're talking about and having up-to-date numbers, I mean, I saw the press release yesterday, and I think there were those who are working on this in a more hands-on way would be keen to make sure that they, when they are able to do so, and I don't know when the time is for releasing of data and that sort of thing, but when they're able to do so, give you the most up-to-date figures that they can to make sure that what you're not working from is figures that are from the past, and you need to know what the situation is now. I think it's really important. I think you get 6 monthly updates on some aspects of figures that
I think we've got Jeff Jacobs, the head of Pay Service.
Can we just answer this one question now based on what was in the press notice that was released yesterday, which were 2016 figures, as it fairly said, and said that 7 out of 25 staff earning over 94k were women, so that's equivalent to 28%. The figure now is that 11 out of 29 staff earning over 94k are women. That's a 10% increase on the figures compared to what was in the press release quoting 2016. So there, has been a dramatic improvement, which, thanks to the work that's going on in this place, we're trying to achieve. The other thing, and Juliet can add to this, the other thing is obvious to say, we are dealing with extremely low turnover at this level as compared to the rest of the organisation. It's about 4%. So actually the improvement that's been made is pretty dramatic in terms of what we've been able to do given these turnover figures.
Surely what you said is welcome news. The question is also what happens in terms of pay gap in terms of part-time work.
Well, we can give you more data on that.
Yeah.
Juliet, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so we are running the data currently for 2017, and obviously the GLA group are doing the same, so we'll be looking to publish that data in, I would say it will be autumn, as a group again, as we did last time, so still ahead of the statutory deadline, and we'll compare part-time and full-time and give again very detailed breakdown that is over and above what's required statutorily, but at every grade, so you'll be able to draw comparisons. But yeah, we've seen some quite significant improvements over a number of years at women earning 60k or more. So we've moved from something like 31% to 44% since 2008. But as Jeff said, at those more senior levels, the turnover is very low year on year. So being able to impact at that level is difficult.
We'd also like to know what is being done, both from your end or generally, in terms of progression of women at senior level beyond 95k, as you mentioned, because that is important as well, retention and progression of what's being done as a policy Chair, I have a further question. We talked about the gender pay gap and action plan for that. Are you prepared? Would you support establishment of an ethnic pay gap report for City Hall?
In principle, I'd be very keen to do something like that. The reason I'm not giving a firm yes is because I'd need to take advice on the feasibility of it. I need to take advice on what models there are that we could follow. And if there is a reason why we can't do it, I'd want to be able to know that, to be able to then tell you why we couldn't. But my starting position on this is I'd be very keen to do it if we can, because I think it would be a welcome step. But all I can say is I don't know the feasibility of it, so I can't give a hard yes.
Can you please come back to us?
Yes.
Both on City Hall as well as GLA.
I mean, I can tell you that informally, I've met with BAME members of staff, not just on an individual basis, but in groups, who have all expressed interest in this, while recognising that it's a more complex proposition than a gender pay audit. And so it would be, for me, it would be about the mechanism of finding something that's reliable and accurate more than whether it's a good idea or not. To me, I can see why it'd be valuable. It's just the mechanism of whether it's feasible.
Chair, if I can raise the third and important question, which takes us outside the City Hall and GLA, in terms of Mayor's also indicated his commitment to ensuring that functional bodies and larger contractors would also be required to publish a gender pay audit. Can you update us as to what progress is being made for both functional bodies as well as the large contractors when it comes to their approach and work?
I'll certainly hand over to Juliet Carter, but could I imagine, could we come back to you in writing on this?
All right.
Thank you very much.
Gareth Bacon.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just on that last point, would you, if you commit to do that, could you define what a large contractor is? And how you'd measure that? Would it be on number of staff? Would it be on the turnover? Would it be on profit? I understand entirely the intention behind this, but I think we need to be clear about the definitions that we're using.
I mean, I think rather than trying to provide answers ad hoc, that's probably something best put in writing for you.
Yeah, cool.
Assembly Member Keith Prince.
Thank you. Given the main determinants of child poverty, which is housing costs, low pay and benefits systems, as they're not wholly within the GLA's control, what practical measures can we support to address these issues? You know, such as supporting the Mayor's Fund for London initiatives to provide free meals for schools, etc. But what can we actually do to influence and help people get out, or young people get out of child poverty, when most of the factors that cause it are not within the Mayor's control?
It's a very good point, and in fact, it's something I've been asking my team to focus in on. And as you know, we have some officers who are very focused on child poverty or poverty generally. First of all, it's important to work closely with Joanne McCartney, who deals with young people in the context of education. Because I think lining child poverty work with education work is very important for all sorts of obvious reasons. But I think the Mayor's efforts really in trying to reduce poverty have encompassed things like trying to help low-income Londoners through affordable housing programmes or through transport reductions in fares or hopper fares and things of that kind. And also promoting a living wage and making sure that there's more money within a household. And we hope that the business compact work will contribute to that. But you're right, in terms of the kind of broader macroeconomic factors, it is quite difficult to be able to work through what are the key things the Mayor can do to shift what could broadly be described as macroeconomic policy in a way that can help child poverty. There are two answers I think I can give now. Neither of them are complete answers, though I fully accept that. The first is that the reasons I explained already, I'm hoping that this exact question is a question I put to those around the poverty roundtables that I held. And they are trying to help us come up with answers that they think can provide an answer to what the mayor's role is in being able to assist in that work. Because my direction question to me is very similar to yours. We're sitting here, what can the mayor do? It's different to say what should government be doing, what can the mayor do? And so we're hoping to be able to get some meaningful answers from them that would guide us into best policy. And then I think to some extent it's about, the second bit of my answer would be, it's about how I try and influence other policies that best deal with poverty generally, and to some degree where they can deal with child poverty in the context of transport, education, housing, skills, those sorts of things. But I mean, I fully accept we are in a situation where it's one of those areas where the mayor is dealing with an entrenched problem or a long-standing problem without enormous powers to be able to move it forward.
I think you're right. I think clearly your role could be to influence policy makers.
Yeah.
I mean, and of all the things that you list that have been done so far, really none of that has any effect. I mean, I mean, he hasn't reduced fares. I mean, he said reduced fares. He hasn't reduced fares, but although he did promise to do so. I accept that the hobby fare helps people with limited income, although that doesn't directly help children because children get free fares. But I don't think the mayor, and I'm not being critical of you or the mayor on this, but I don't think the mayor would stand on a stage and say, I've helped to cure child poverty by introducing hopper fares. I don't think that was his link on that. So it would be interesting, and obviously you're going to need time to think about it, and you're going to have your round table. So it would be interesting to find out what the outcomes of those are, and if there are any ways in which the mayor can actually help reduce child poverty, because I think, regrettably, his powers are very limited in this area.
I mean, the only thing I would add, with the indulgence of the chair, just for 30 seconds, the only thing I would add is that because this is an important area to us, and you see it in the vision document, one of the things I would try and do is see if I can utilise other aspects of my remit to be able to direct them in, push them in that direction. So one day you might invite me back to talk about volunteering in sport, and if you do, then I'll be happy to explain to you some of the stuff that we're trying to do around those areas. Yeah. The community sports offer that we're developing is a really interesting proposition, I think, and we are at the early stages of being able to develop it. But we hope that what it will be doing is directing energies into areas of London that can be pulled into sport, and that can help with child poverty and at least be directed at children and young people in a more meaningful way. Similarly, there's stuff we want to do around working with the education team, and also in relation to volunteering. If we are able to focus volunteering in particular directions, it may be that we can use the power of volunteering to be able to influence some of the movement in that direction if we're looking at where we can target our volunteering offer.
I would be interested in, it can be a written update, Mr. Chairman, possibly through you, on the outcomes of your round table on this, and what areas you think we can help influence. Because I think we all support the Mayor's ambition in trying to eliminate child poverty, but it's very difficult to see what levers he can pull, really.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jeanette Arnold.
Chair, I'll just start by saying the Mayor of London has got such an important role to play in terms of leadership on the issue of poverty. If a Mayor of London is silent on this issue, that would be just totally unacceptable. And if a Mayor of London would have nothing to say or do about the circumstances that impact on our children, that would be just totally immoral, and that person should not hold office. So I'm going to go back to Matthew and say, in terms of the statement you made earlier about London being a great place to grow up, I'm not saying that's going to be the forefront of your work, but don't you think that this is an area that is so critical, given the circumstances that our children find themselves, that really we would be wanting to see some outputs or some actions in this area as soon as possible?
Yeah, so if there's a risk of me being misunderstood, I'm grateful for being, that being drawn to my attention, because I think it's really important to be clear on this. The Mayor has a very, very important advocacy role on an issue like this. There is no question about that. That's why we've given the emphasis that we have in terms of meeting poverty groups, and that's why the Mayor, at the very minimum, is vocal and takes extremely seriously the issue of child poverty. So when I'm having a discussion with the Assembly member, Mr Prince, about what are the hard levers that the Mayor has, I wouldn't want that to be confused with any concept that the Mayor doesn't take this issue seriously. For the very reasons that you referred back to, I see, because the Mayor sees child poverty as being such an important issue, that's why that I refer to it as probably the most important of the diversity inclusion vision that we've talked about. I take that cue from the Mayor because that's his concern. Similarly, we have officers who are focused on poverty within the team because the Mayor takes that very important, child poverty in particular. So the frustration, in a sense, comes because this is an area where the Mayor has an enormous, important interest and enthusiasm to try and make change without commensurate powers to be able to move those levers in a very meaningful way. And so what we're trying to do is be creative and find important ways to be able to affect change. You're absolutely right that we should do everything we can to find outputs, which is why we're consulting with the poverty organisations through the roundtables. But more than that, the advocacy and being able to support those who do have those powers, or to be able to direct those powers in the right way, is something the Mayor thinks is very important. All I would say is I'm very hopeful that when we have the experts and the right organisations that we've been consulting around the round tables giving us feedback as to what they think the Mayor can do with the powers that he has, we're going to be able to develop some pretty good outputs and deliverables. But at the moment, we need their help in working out how do we focus that energy in terms of what the Mayor's powers are at the moment to be in a situation where we can make change. What we don't want to happen is a situation where this problem continues. But we've got to work out, I've got to work out why hasn't that been shifted before within the GLA before this Mayor, and how is this Mayor going to change that? Because he does see it as a priority.
Chair, I'm just saying on record, our previous Mayor had no responsibility for aviation, but that did not stop him spending
£5 million
millions of pounds.
So
there's the bar, no responsibility, 5 million spent. So clearly we can see that being overtaken. And also, the first Mayor had no responsibility in legislation about introducing the sea charge. And also as well, coming back to an area that we've taken serious, education, we don't have a responsibility. But again, one of the best things, it seems to me, that came out of the last mayoralty was he seized the opportunity to work with government. And he produced, for me, one of the best programmes of his time, and that was the interventions that he made in education. So when you look at that intervention on education and see what can be carried on and, model that, because it shows that it can be done, it shows that it is possible to work with government on an issue that's important to London. And if it's important to London, it's important to our government and to our country.
First of all, I couldn't agree more. Secondly, just to take a small point, what I was talking about was not responsibility, I was talking about powers, statutory powers. Now, the Mayor's statutory powers may be limited. That doesn't mean the Mayor wouldn't want to do everything he possibly can within the areas that he has to try and make the lives of young Londoners better and address child poverty. Of course he does. Of course this is a priority. And so there's no question about that. The only issue is how is that done most effectively, not just through my team, but across as you rightly point out, across the responsibilities of a number of documents. It ranges from health through education to environment. All of those things affect young Londoners, all of those aspects of child poverty, all of those impact aspects of child poverty. So just to reassure, if this is where your point is directed, just to reassure you, this is a very, very important area of work for the Mayor, and he will utilise he will try and do whatever he can within the powers that he has, within the framework that he has, to make sure that if there is some way of shifting this problem and changing it, we take the best advice and we act on that.
Thank you.
John Berry?
just a point of sort of to back up what Assembly Member Arnold was saying there, and just to reiterate again that the Mayor does have powers within planning rules about rents, and housing costs are absolutely at the heart of child poverty in terms of family incomes. So just to leave living rent as something, a blunt instrument on the average wage, without looking in more detail at the impact of families, households headed by women, the difference that can be from the average, is not something that the Mayor should do. The Mayor, because that is one of the main powers he does have, and to not use it to its fullest would be wrong.
I think, in fairness, when I first was asked this question, I was talking about the different ways that the Mayor would be able to try and reduce poverty, including all of the other aspects that feed into economic fairness, whether it's rent, whether it's when I did mention housing costs, whether it's a fair economic business compact or whatever those things are. So when I was asked this question, I think probably my concern is almost the other end, which is that all of these things are really important. All of these things we can do. My concern is that we still the end point that we have to get to is this situation. We want to change it. It's no good saying, well, we can try and do this in terms of reducing the income, the cost to a household of rent, or all those things are really important. But the point that was being made to me, as I understood it from Mr. Prince, is saying those things are important, but how do you focus in on child poverty? Not just not just poverty generally, because it does contribute to child poverty, but what other interventions can you do that will focus in on child poverty? I think you're right to the extent that all of those things contribute to that overall goal, and the Mayor obviously will do his very best to utilise powers in which he can then affect change. But what I'm trying to do is find out, and all of the deputy mayors are working on that. What I'm trying to do is find out through the consultations we've been doing and by using the roundtables, is there something that we're missing in terms of not just the powers which we can use to reduce poverty? Is there something additional that we can do that can focus in on child poverty, that the Mayor can utilise some powers or options that he has that could shift the needle on what's been a long-standing problem? And if your point is you should leave no stone unturned in trying to do that and use what powers you can, couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I'm just slightly worried there's a bit of a blind spot when it comes to living rent, that's just like, we've got a number and that's job done, because I think it is more complicated than that, particularly for families, and I'd love it if you would look at that in a bit more detail. To see
I can say on behalf, from my understanding of the Mayor's position, there's certainly no blind spot when it comes to child poverty, that's for sure.
Good.
Members, are there any further questions that you wish to ask? Okay, can I just I mean, this is quite an exciting, challenging agenda, I think, and we're on the cusp of doing something slightly different than we've done in the past. I'm torn between, if I was sitting in your position of, and I don't think that there's one right answer to this, do you concentrate on a broad front or do you concentrate on a narrow front? There's a great saying of think big but act small in terms of achievement around that, because the reliance on moving forward on the agenda that you've outlined to us is around officer capacity, is about engagement with others and getting an influence in others to do it. Tell us about that that thinking that you've gone through about, because that choice was open to you. Do you know what I mean? And I'm sort of torn, which would have gone, I would have done the narrow, but I don't think personally that you can go down on a narrow front. You have to go on the broad front. But what's your thinking through that?
I'm smiling because it's a question that I've been asking myself virtually every day since October. The reality is that you're totally right. The temptation is that you find one or two key things and you try and trim down your area so that you can just be very, very focused and make sure those things get done. In practice, it can't work like that. In practice, you've got to be broader. And for example, the community engagement work we've had to do around Grenfell or around the terrorist incidents is a really good illustration of how when you think that there are, other things that you're focusing in on, something tragic happens and all of your attention, quite rightly, gets diverted to making sure those issues are resolved on the community engagement front, for example. I think the answer to your question is we do have to have a watch over the breadth of what we're doing, but it becomes meaningless if you don't pick some key things to do and work out how am I actually going to achieve those. So my priority in this period between sort of leading up to September, I think, is working out how do we make sure that when we press the button on the key things that we're doing, and we're starting to do that now, the citizenship initiative is an example, how do we make sure we don't divert all our energies across too broad a range and we can focus in on those things. I'm meeting with members of that team next week who are going to present me with their specific action ideas, and I'm going to start to work those up with them with that very much in mind.
Okay. How do we go forward from this? Clearly there might be some questions. We're going to look at your answers. On the other remits that you hold, or portfolios you hold, I would like to come up with some questions around those that we send you in a written form that will form part of a public document that may form about when we bring you back and looking at sports and volunteering. And that might be a useful way of showcasing, but also about us focusing about some of the other areas that we ought to question you on. At some stage, you've got to get on with the day job. Calling you in, we're very grateful for the way that you answered our questions this morning.
Thank you.
I particularly am taken by, from your presentation, we had about 6 or 7 people asking questions in a way that I thought that you stimulated our thinking around the topic. So I want to thank you for that. I think what we should do is bring you back on a regular basis, and we might want to think about owning on over a course of a year one particular theme about how you're getting on, or maybe at the end of reflection about how we do. But we will engage with you further about that. How do we do that scrutiny? Jeanette.
Chair, can we just hear about when launches are going to be taken? Because I understand that you said you've got stuff in there, but I understand you're due to launch some work or an initiative.
I think I've got to be slightly careful with this. Some announcements are coming next week, I think, about work that we're doing or work that we've done. I think there are going to be we've obviously got the diversity and inclusion strategy coming towards the end of the year, and I think our big announcements of work are probably around September or something like that.
Well, Chair, through your office, can we ask that you liaise with Matthew, because I think it's so important, because there are some members who, on the day that is launched, we will be bombarded with questions, and it would be just, I think it's a reasonable thing for us to ask for any pre-warning or embargoed copy that we could get of anything that's been launched. So
there is an arrangement that we have as an assembly around those announcements. We'll explore that further.
Can I mention 2 points very, very, very shortly? First is on that last point, I welcome that as much as the Assembly members might, because, for example, when we launched our citizenship initiative, we were really proud of it. It's a really exciting idea. The way we've pulled in funds that have helped the GLA, it didn't get the attention that we hoped it would get from wider parties, even though we think it's going to be a really groundbreaking idea. It's one of those things that will have a slow burn that will develop. So we'd welcome that sort of level of publicity and energy around our announcements. Secondly, it would be remiss for me not to recognise that Amanda and Francis and McAndrew and Julia Slay, who sit behind me, have been really fantastic working in conditions within the team that have stretched them fully. And, for all of the points you're making about my work, Amanda and others have really been outstanding in trying to make sure it's all done in a way that gets us to where we need to be on the timetable that we're on. So really a huge thank you to them and others. They've been absolutely fantastic.
And just one thing for me, we actually have launched a consultation on the diversity and inclusion strategy, so we'd really appreciate your response, and also if you can actually share that more widely across your networks to actually stimulate some thinking and some responses to that. So we'd really appreciate your help on that too.
Okay. Well, thank you for the way you answer the questions, and we wish you well for the future.
Thank you.
But also, actually looking forward to continuous engagement with you on the work.
Yeah, I'd welcome that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to the main agenda then. And we've got item 10 then, the Mayor's Annual Equalities Report. We're asked to note the Assembly's contribution to the Mayor's Annual Equalities Report 2016/17. which has been incorporated into the Mayor's Annual Report 2016-17. Do you wish to... Sorry, Andrew Boff?
Just to redress some of the balance in the future, seeing as we're included in the Mayor's report, the Mayor's report seems to have an awful lot of photographs of the Mayor in there, not talking to the Assembly. Do you think we could have a photograph in our section of the Mayor actually talking to the Assembly? Admittedly, you'd have to have a very, very quick photograph taken, but at least it might give it might give us an impression that this is actually part of his job.
Photoshop him in,
The Assembly member makes a very good point. No doubt, listening ears in the bit of the Assembly that might be to do with photographs will seek to incorporate that. Shall we move? Shall we note that and the Assembly members' remarks? Let's move on to item 11, proposed change to the GLA Establishment Intelligence Unit. Do we want the officers to introduce, or are there any questions? Because obviously Assembly members have read their reports.
Absolutely.
Okay, are there any comments that members wish to make? Okay, that means that we've got no points to make. Thank you very much for your attendance.
So worthwhile for you.
Item 12, proposed changes to GLA Establishment Education Youth Team. Do you wish officers to present, or is it the same? Have you got any questions to officers? No? Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll note those proposals. Moving on to item 13, walking and cycling, outer London junctions, proposals for rapporteurship. Is this straightforward, or do you wish the chair of the Transport Committee to speak in support?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
Good luck.
Sounds very good.
Item 14, people's question time. We're asked to note and comment on proposals for people's question time. Where are we off to?
The last time.
Oh, right, okay.
You and I were there, that's all we went.
Oh, right, we went there. Sean Berry.
Just one thing, it says in the report that there will be an accessibility kind of plan made. Can I ask that we get captioning and signing but as a matter of course at these events? Because every time someone asks, and every time there's a bit of a scramble.
Really?
Usually signing.
Always signing.
It's not mentioned in the report.
It always do.
Yeah, and
We
the
always
last
do.
one, there was a request, and I think it had to be actioned.
There was one where we didn't.
It was a
Yeah.
shortage. There was
Yeah.
nobody available.
Which wasn't the GLA's fault, patient
Can we double check and all that and write to the Assembly member and copy us all in so we can see that? Yeah.
There was a scramble at one point.
Well, we need a plan B, don't we? So if it fails, what's the plan B on the night? And so we want to be assured there is a plan B if something occurs. Okay, moving on from 14, so we can agree, note that. 15, Secretariat Quarterly Review, Quarter 4. Is there any questions to officers on that point? Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to the work programme. On the second, we've had, to be fair, we have had a discussion outside the meeting on this. Is there any points that members wish to raise formally? Okay, can we agree? We note the work programme. Item 17, date of the next meeting is the 18th of July 2017 at 10 o'clock in Committee Room 5. Item 18, there is no urgent business, colleagues, but I do think that we should pay tribute to Juliet Carter's work. This is her last meeting for us at Oversight. Thank you very much for the work you've done on behalf of the GLA, and we wish you well in terms of your future. Okay. Do you want to tell us where you're going?
I'm going to C40, which is an organisation I think quite a lot of people will know.
Well done. Thank you.
So can I congratulations? Can I just say we're losing a senior female woman. However, thanks to our recruitment arrangements, we are appointing a senior female.
We need to appoint 2 though for everyone that we lose.
The shortlisting stage, I hope.
No, we didn't. But the final shortlist had 3 women and 1 man.
Thanks to the officers supporting our work at today's meeting, and thank you to the members in the way that you asked your questions. I declare the meeting closed.